On the afternoon of May 10, 1960, a heavy cargo truck was intercepted by Senegalese authorities. The vehicle bore the markings of French shipments. The officers working this border demanded to have a look. They must have noticed the truck's suspension riding unusually low and wondered what could be in this truck. Well, when they ordered the cargo compartment opened, they were greeted with the shock of their lives. Inside were wooden crates marked with French military ordnance codes. When officials pried them open, they discovered military weapons traceable to French arsenals, including submachine guns, rifles, grenades, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Documentation in the truck's cab came from the French military base at Pierce, 70 kilometers east of Dakar. This single discovery would unravel a conspiracy that stretched from French intelligence headquarters in Paris to training camps hidden in the Senegalese countryside to a printing press churning out counterfeit money. The French government had given this operation a name, Parcel, like the laundry detergent, something that cleans away stains. This was symbolic. France wanted to wash away Guinea's independence and remove the president of Guinea from power. But to understand why a former colonial power ended up trying to destroy a sovereign nation with forged currency and trained mercenaries, we need to go back 2 years to a speech that changed everything.
À une crise nationale extrêmement grave. Mais aussi ce peut être le début d'une espèce de résurrection.
In September 1958, Charles de Gaulle presented every French African colony with a choice. His new constitution created something called the French Community, a framework where colonies would have internal autonomy while France retained control over defense, currency, and foreign policy. Vote yes and you stay in the family, but vote no and you get immediate independence. But de Gaulle made the consequences clear. Rejection meant what French commentators would later call divorce without alimony. France would withdraw everything, all aid, all investment, all technical support. Any colony that voted no would be left to survive alone. On August 25, 1958, de Gaulle arrived in Conakry, Guinea's capital. He addressed a massive crowd at the city stadium, warning that independence would bring poverty and isolation. The French community offered development, cooperation, and continued French investment. Well, the choice seemed obvious. Then, a 36-year-old trade unionist named Ahmed Sékou Touré took the podium. What Touré said next would define Guinea's future and seal its fate. Speaking directly to de Gaulle, with the international press recording every word, he declared,
"Il n'y a pas de dignité sans liberté. Nous préférons la pauvreté dans la liberté à la richesse dans l'esclavage."
There is no dignity without freedom. We prefer poverty in freedom to wealth in slavery, Touré continued. He said that any association imposed against a people's will degrades those upon whom it weighs. He said that Guineans would never abandon their legitimate right to independence. He said that only mutual recognition of sovereignty could create a genuine partnership. De Gaulle left Conakry furious. According to witnesses, he made clear to his advisors that Touré would face consequences for this public humiliation. 1 month later, Guinea voted. The results arrived like a thunderclap. Out of 1.2 million votes cast, 95.22% said no. Only 4.78% voted to remain with France. Guinea became the only French African territory to reject de Gaulle's constitution. The contrast with other colonies was stark. Ivory Coast voted nearly unanimously yes. Senegal voted overwhelmingly yes. Even Niger, which had significant opposition, they voted yes. Within 72 hours of the results, France began its revenge.
Nous avons quant à nous un premier et indispensable besoin, celui de notre dignité.
On October 2nd, 1958, Guinea proclaimed independence. The French response was immediate and systematic. Thousands of French civil servants, teachers, doctors, and military personnel received orders to evacuate. But they weren't just told to leave, they were told to take everything and destroy what they couldn't carry. French technicians dismantled telephone exchanges across Guinea. They cut cables, removed switchboards, and destroyed technical documentation. Telegraph machines were disassembled. Radio transmitters were pulled from government buildings. Within days, Guinea had no reliable long-distance communication. Government archives containing decades of records were burned in bonfires outside administrative buildings. Property registries, tax records, census data, court judgments, all destroyed. When Guinean officials entered former colonial offices, they found empty rooms scattered with ashes. Every government building was stripped. Typewriters, filing cabinets, office supplies, all removed. French officials unscrewed even light bulbs from fixtures. They took door handles, they smashed windows. The governor's residence, which Touré would occupy as president, was emptied of furniture, curtains, and bathroom fixtures. The cruelty in healthcare was particularly devastating. French doctors and nurses received evacuation orders with instructions to depart almost immediately. They removed X-ray machines, surgical instruments, and microscopes. But the most vindictive action involved pharmaceutical supplies. You see, rather than leaving medicine for the Guinean population, French doctors burned stocks of antibiotics, vaccines, and essential drugs in hospital courtyards. Insulin, anti-malaria medications, painkillers, all of them destroyed. The French military assisted, ensuring no usable medical supplies remained. Guinea was left with just a few medical assistants, but no well-trained physicians. The attack on Guinea's financial system was calculated to prevent the new government from functioning. On October 1st and 2nd, French military personnel entered the colonial central bank office and removed all currency reserves. Soldiers loaded crates of cash onto trucks and transported them to the port, where French naval vessels waited. Billions in CFA francs seized, banking records, account ledgers, and transaction histories all were burned. French engineers sabotaged infrastructure with particular focus on Chronicles utilities. They removed technical drawings for the sewage system and water distribution network. They poured concrete into key pipeline junctions. The French had been constructing a modern sewage system. They confiscated the engineering plans and filled installed pipes with cement. The French government also stopped paying pensions to thousands of Guinean veterans who had served in French wars, including World War II. These veterans, many disabled or elderly, lost their primary income overnight. This was impertinence. Each act served a strategic purpose. France wanted to make Guinea's independence as painful as possible, a warning to any other colony considering defiance. They wanted to prevent Touré's government from demonstrating competence. They wanted to make Guinea economically unviable, and they wanted to force Guinea into dependence on external assistance that France could monitor and potentially manipulate. But the destruction wasn't enough. In Paris, something darker was already taking shape. The man who designed France's covert war against Guinea was this guy, Jacques Foccart. As the girl's chief advisor on African affairs, Foccart operated in the shadows of French power. He reported directly to the president, bypassing the foreign ministry entirely, and he would later become the architect of what critics called France Afrique, the network of intelligence operations, compliant dictators, and economic arrangements through which France maintained control over its former colonies. Foccart's plan for Guinea had three components. The first was a mercenary army. In Dakar, the capital of newly independent Senegal, French intelligence officers from the External Documentation and Counter-Espionage Service began recruiting Guinean exiles. Many of them were former colonial employees. Others were just political opponents of Touré's party. Some belonged to ethnic groups that had supported continued French rule. By early 1960, Dozens of recruits were training at a camp near Thiès, officially designated as a French military training area for Senegalese forces. In reality, it was controlled entirely by French intelligence. The instructors came from the 11th Shock Parachute Regiment, the SDECE's elite paramilitary unit, veterans of France's brutal war in Algeria. The training lasted 8 weeks. Recruits learned to handle MAT-49 submachine guns and MAS-36 rifles. They learned demolitions, how to use plastic explosives to destroy bridges, power lines, and government buildings. They learned guerrilla tactics for operating in Guinea's mountainous Fouta Djallon region. They learned about assassination techniques. And by April 1960, hundreds of fighters were organized into operational groups designated Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Each was assigned a different region of Guinea. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on government outposts, destruction of infrastructure, and eventually an assault on Conakry itself. The second component was economic warfare through counterfeit currency. Guinea, you see, had created its own currency in 1959, the Guinean franc, breaking from the French-controlled CFA franc system. This was precisely the kind of monetary independence that threatened French economic dominance across Africa. So, if Guinea could survive outside the franc zone, other colonies might follow. French printing facilities produced approximately 600 million franc worth of counterfeit. The forgeries were sophisticated. In fact, when Czechoslovakia experts later examined samples, they confirmed the paper quality actually exceeded the legitimate currency. The injection strategy was calculated for maximum damage. Small quantities would enter circulation through market traders and commercial transactions. The counterfeits would accumulate gradually, triggering inflation. By late summer, the monetary system would collapse. Touré's government would face simultaneous military attacks and economic catastrophe. And the third component was coordination. The plan called for phased escalation. April and May would see initial counterfeit injection and first insurgent infiltrations. June and July would bring an acceleration of both. August and September would see military attacks coinciding with currency collapse. And by October, if the government showed signs of destabilization, French-backed forces would assault Conakry, capture or kill Touré, and install a provisional government. The operation was allegedly funded by top figures in the French government. Pierre Mesmer, the Minister of Armies, authorized weapons transfer from French arsenals. Maurice Robert, head of SDECE's Africa Division, commanded field operations from Dakar under diplomatic cover. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Well, until the warning started. In March 1960, Guinean border guards intercepted a man attempting to cross from Senegal with 50,000 Guinean francs in new bills. The notes appeared genuine but had subtle printing variations. Guinea's newly formed security services sent samples to Czechoslovakian experts in Conakry, who confirmed they were indeed sophisticated forgeries. Touré was immediately alerted to the threat, but initially believed it was the work of private counterfeiters. In April, a French diplomat named Albert Champon learned of Operation Parcel through casual conversation with an intelligence officer. Champon was horrified. He sent a secret telegram to the Foreign Ministry warning that clandestine activities in Senegal risked creating a major political scandal. Within days, Champon was reassigned to French Polynesia. But the warning had reached sympathetic ears. Information began leaking to the French press. Meanwhile, Guinea received intelligence from its new Eastern Bloc allies. Czechoslovakian intelligence reported unusual French financial transactions in Dakar consistent with counterfeiting operations. Soviet intelligence reported French military training activities near Thiès involving Guinean exiles. Touré's security apparatus heightened border surveillance. Then came May 10, 1960. The weapons shipment was intercepted and Operation Parcel began collapsing. Within 48 hours, Senegalese military police raided the Thiès training camp. They found what some reported to be around 300 Guinean nationals in French military uniforms, training with French weapons. The Senegalese investigation traced everything to French military stocks. Serial numbers matched French arsenals. Documentation bore French military stamps. Prime Minister Mamadou Dia of Senegal was furious. Despite his country's close relationship with France, Dia was a nationalist who had fought for independence. He viewed the weapons shipment as a violation of Senegalese sovereignty. He sent a formal protest to de Gaulle, demanding an explanation and warning that such actions endangered peace in West Africa. The French government initially denied any involvement, claiming the weapons were organized by private mercenaries acting without state authorizations. Well, the denial was unconvincing. Everything pointed to official French involvement. So, with the whole operation unraveling around him, Foucault convened an emergency meeting at the Élysée Palace with de Gaulle, Mesmer, and SDECE leadership. The decision was made at this point to terminate Operation Parcel immediately. Maurice Robert received orders to shut down the training facility, disperse the recruits, and destroy all incriminating documents. Within 48 hours, the TS camp was emptied. Recruits were paid off and told to disappear. The millions in counterfeit francs sitting in Dakar warehouse never reached Guinea's economy. The French intelligence officer later explained the failure. Foucault had pushed for early action, claiming internal networks risk being neutralized. But at the date he insisted upon, most weapons had only reached the border zones. The operation, as he put it, ended in total failure. Operation Parcel failed, but its consequences shaped Guinea for decades. Touré's resistance to French aggression preserved something real. Guinea's sovereignty existed. Its independent currency existed. The vote of September 28, 1958 mattered, but the constant threat of French-backed coups became justification for an authoritarian security state. Camp Boiro, a detention facility in Conakry, became the center of Touré's repression. Over his 26 years in power, Amnesty International said around 50,000 people died there. Some of them political opponents, ethnic minorities, anyone suspected of foreign connections, all became targets. The external threat was real. Operation Parcel proved France was actively trying to destroy Guinea's government, but the internal response vastly exceeded legitimate security needs. Guinea achieved independence from France only to fall into Soviet and Chinese dependency. The concentration of power needed to resist external threats enabled the brutality that would define Touré's legacy. And this is the tragedy of successful resistance. Touré is simultaneously celebrated as a hero of African independence and condemned in the West as a brutal dictator. And both had some elements of truth to them. The contradiction reflects the impossible dilemma faced by African leaders seeking genuine sovereignty in a system designed to prevent it. For France, Operation Parcel's failure was tactical, not strategic. The message reached every African leader, challenged French interests, and faced economic destruction, covert warfare, and international isolation. The CFA franc system tightened. Guinea's departure from the franc zone, though successful, looked catastrophic enough that no other leader dared follow for decades. France-Afrique, the system Touré defied, would dominate the continent for 60 more years. And I know you may be wondering, why is this story relevant now? Well, you see, in June 2024, Mali's President Colonel Assimi Goïta stood before a stadium crowd in Sikasso and made an explosive accusation. France, he said, had attempted 3 times to inject counterfeit CFA francs into Mali's economy. Twice by road, once by air, all intercepted. France, he said, had used similar tactics before. He was describing Operation Parcel. Mali had expelled French troops in 2022 after the military coup that brought Goïta to power. France responded with economic pressure, ECOWAS sanctions, and according to Goïta, renewed sabotage. His accusations remain unverified by independent sources, of course, but they resonated across Francophone Africa because the pattern was recognizable. The CFA franc still binds 14 African nations to the French treasury. French companies control critical ports across the continent. When African leaders assert genuine sovereignty, they face economic punishment through mechanisms that have evolved since 1960 but serve the same purpose. Operation Parcel was named after a laundry detergent, something that cleans away stains. So France wanted to wash away Guinea's independence, to bleach African sovereignty back to colonial white. Well, they failed. Sékou Touré proved that alternatives to French domination were possible, however costly. His defiance inspired generations of African nationalists. The vote of September 1958 demonstrated that ordinary Africans, given the choice, would choose freedom over subjugation. But the stain of that conflict never quite washed out. Not from Guinea, which suffered decades of authoritarian rule born from justified paranoia. And not from France, whose covert operations established patterns that continue today. Not from the relationship between former colonizer and colonized, still defined by the question Touré posed in 1958. What is the price of freedom? And who decides whether it's worth paying?